We're going to continue now looking at the Bible's literary genre. Genre is a French word meaning a literary type of writing. Literary genre refers to the category, then, or kind of writing characterized by the particular form or content of the passage you're dealing with. To interpret the Bible accurately, you really must take into account not only the individual words, which we talked about how they're inspired, and the sentences, etc., but also the kind of literature you're studying. Poetry would be evaluated differently than a narrative portion of Scripture. It's a different kind of writing. It's a different genre. So, the following are some of the various recognized genres of the Bible. The first one we want to discuss would be legal literature. Right off the bat, in the Pentateuch, first 5 books of the Bible, you have God giving Israel His law. It includes that body of material containing God's commandments to Israel. We're all familiar with that. The portions of Scripture that have the focus on law would be Exodus chapters 20 through 40, Leviticus, portions of Numbers as well, and we have some chapters listed in your notes, and almost all of Deuteronomy, which is Moses giving the law a second time to the generation that goes in to conquer the promised land. Legal literature contains 2 kinds of material, basically. There is what they call apodictic law. This would involve direct commandments, such as the 10 Commandments. You're all familiar with that. You shall not do certain things. You shall not or do not do certain things. These laws are not necessarily exhaustive, as we have in the 10 Commandments. For example, Leviticus 19:14 would apply to other handicapped individuals as well, where it talks about not putting a stumbling block in the way of a blind man. That's a do not. You're not to do that. That's apodictic law. And then they have what they call causistic law, case-by-case law, kind of what goes on in our courtrooms. In these commands, a condition setting forth a specific situation kind of introduces the law or the principle, and an example of that would be in Deuteronomy 15, 7 through 17. And I'm not going to read that because I have an example that uses both apodictic and causistic law together. If you want to turn to Exodus chapter 23, verses 1 through 9, it just titles it in the NASB Sundry Laws, but let's look at our example. Verses 1 through 3 would be apodictic, and you can hear as we read through it. Again, you shall not bear a false report. So there's that concrete, you shall not do something. Do not join your hand with a wicked man to be a malicious witness. You shall not follow the masses in doing evil, nor shall you testify in a dispute so as to turn aside after a multitude in order to pervert justice. And then verse 3, nor shall you, in other words, do not, be partial to a poor man in his dispute. And then verses 4 and 5, we have the change to causistic or case law. And let's read that. If you meet your enemy's ox or his donkey wandering away, you shall surely return it to him. If you see the donkey of one who hates you lying helpless under its load, you shall refrain from leaving it to him. You shall surely release it with him. Now that's a case law that uses an example, but it's not exhaustive. You would take that law and then apply it in other situations. It may not be an ox or a donkey, but other situations it would be applicable, and they would expect you to pick up on that and apply the principle in other cases not specifically mentioned in the text. Then it goes back to apodictic in verses 6 through 9. You shall not pervert the justice due to your needy brother in his dispute. Clear. Keep far from a false charge. Do not kill the innocent or the righteous. For I, God says, will not acquit the guilty. You shall not take a bribe. That's not up for debate. For a bribe blinds the clear-sighted and subverts the cause of the just. You shall not oppress a stranger, since you yourselves know the feelings of a stranger, for you also were strangers in the land of Egypt. Again, we have things that give us the two kinds of law, but they're not exhaustive in these examples. And legal literature is very significant. God's laws given to Israel reflect what? They reflect His very nature. The law that He gives them is holy. It has a holy, righteous character, like Paul says in Romans 7:12. So then, the law is holy and the commandment is holy and righteous and good. Of course, sin takes it and enslaves people. But the bottom line is it's a reflection of who God is as these laws are given to Israel. They were to be a light to the nations and shine the light on His holy character by promoting this beautiful law. Another thought that's very important in the Old Testament, when you read through the Pentateuch and you get to these books of law, like that are in Exodus portions and in Leviticus, and I'm sure you've read them and you kind of go, wow, this is just tedious, and man, I hope I get through this quick. But the bottom line is, for a righteous man in Israel, the law was good. It was his delight. You find that, just go read Psalm 119. Oh, how I love your law. It's my meditation all the day. Lord, teach me your law. I want to please you. I want to obey you. It's good for me. And so the righteous delighted in the law because it did reveal God's character to him, provided a way to worship God and express his love for God through obedience to the law, just like it is for us with Jesus. If you love me, you'll keep my commandments. So the law was so good for them to have to behold their God. Legal literature then, and another genre would be narrative literature. All the great stories of the Bible told for the purpose of conveying a message or truth through the accounts of people and their problems and their situations. That's why we would probably call it a theological narrative literature. It's not just given to give you an account, it's given so you learn truth about God and how He interacts with people, nations, and Israel. So consider the following when you're reading biblical narrative. It is selective and it's illustrative. The writers carefully selected the material under the inspiration of the Spirit to accomplish certain purposes. As we're saying, as you read narrative, one good thing to do, especially, is to note the comments of the narrator who's writing the account. Sometimes they will inject thoughts into the narrative, and you want to especially see what's going on there. For example, a good example is in 1 Samuel 30, verses 1 through 8, when David and his men came back to Ziklag after raiding, doing a raiding party. And this Ziklag was where his family was housed and protected. And let's just read. Then it happened when David and his men came to Ziklag on the third day that the Amalekites had made a raid on the Negev and on Ziklag and had overthrown Ziklag and burned it with fire. This is just straight historical narrative. This is what happened. And they took captive the women and all who were in it, both small and great, without killing anyone, and carried them off and went their way. Significant that they didn't kill anyone. When David and his men came to the city, behold, it was burned with fire. Their wives and their sons and their daughters had been taken captive. Then David and the people who were with him lifted their voices and wept until there was no strength in them to weep. You can understand that. What a terrible tragedy. For David himself personally. Now David's two wives had been taken captive, Ahinoam the Jezreelitess and Abigail the widow of Nabal the Carmelite. Moreover, David was greatly distressed because the people spoke of stoning him. He's the leader, so he's got personal pain, and now his men want to blame somebody, and they're going to blame him. For all the people were embittered, each one because of his sons and daughters. And here's where we have this little addition by the narrator that gives you the main point of the story with regard to David and his person. At the end of this verse, it says, "But David strengthened himself in the Lord his God." In the midst of this terrible circumstance, this was David's heart. So when you read those kinds of things, when the narrator puts those in there, it's meant to give you truth and show you how a righteous man responds in these kinds of circumstances. And that's the way, of course, we want to be. So look for those kind of things. Look for those kinds of things in narrative literature. Very important. Other kinds of narrative include the following. And of course, this comes from Dr. Zook's text. One kind of narrative literature, he says, is tragedy. A tragedy is a story of the decline of a person from verity to catastrophe. Examples might be Samson and Saul, where they have a terrible, tragic end. That's an example of that. An epic narrative, a long narrative with a series of episodes unified around an individual or group of people. What would be an example of that? Certainly Israel in the wilderness wanderings as God's dealing with them. That's an epic story about their interaction with God over those 40 years. Romance, for you people who like romance, is a narrative in which a romantic relationship between a man and a woman is narrated. And right away I know what's coming to your mind. Ruth, right? What a great romance. Song of Songs is about the relationship between the king and his bride. It's romantic in the Bible, romance. Heroic narrative, a narrative built around the life and exploits of a hero or protagonist, an individual who is sometimes a representative or an example for others. What would be some examples? Well, you can think of Abraham, you can think of David, and you can think of the Apostle Paul. A heroic narrative, men who loved God and walked with God in the midst of their circumstances, and they're set forth as examples for us. How about satire? A satirical narrative is an exposure of human vice or folly through ridicule or rebuke. And Dr. Zook has Jonah listed as a satire because he's ridiculed for his refusal to accept God's universal compassion, which was even contained in the Abrahamic covenant itself to bless the nations. So he functions, it's a satire. Or maybe a polemic, an argument. A polemical narrative is an aggressive attack against or refuting of the views of others. And you know we have that in our Bibles. The 10 plagues even in Egypt, when God brings the destruction of the Egyptians to deliver his people, we read in a couple places that he's judging the gods of Egypt. It's a polemic against those false gods so that Israel can come to see he's the true God. There are no other gods. Okay. Same thing maybe with Elijah and the prophets of Baal. Remember on Mount Carmel, who is God? Who are you going to serve? And he exposes the foolishness of their false worship as God sets himself on display in contrast to them and against them. I'm the true God. They're worshiping false gods, and so are you, Israel. So these are different kinds of narrative that are worth noting as you read through your scriptures.